Hello there, welcome to another episode of Catalysts, a platform for the scientific community to connect, discover, and transform. This is your host, Kedar Aris, and today it's my distinct pleasure to connect with Dr. Nikki Posnack, Assistant Professor at the George Washington University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C., in the Department of Pharmacology and Physiology. In addition, she is also affiliated with the Children's National Research Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Posniak completed her PhD in pharmacology at the George Washington University and then continued her postdoctoral training, also at GW, during which time she received the prestigious NIH F32 award and later the even more prestigious K99 award given to the outstanding postdoctoral trainees as they transition from being a postdoc to an independent faculty member. Dr. Posniak's primary area of research is cardiac physiology and cardiac toxicity, with focus on investigating the linkage between chemicals used in plastics such as di-2-ethyl hexyl phthalate or DEHP and bisphenol A or BPA and its linkage to cardiovascular diseases. Specifically, her lab investigates how endocrine disrupting chemicals, which are used in manufacturing of medical devices and consumer products, can alter cardiac electrical and mechanical function. She has published in high profile journals, including in Nature, PLOS ONE, among others, and currently has over 28 publications with an H index of 17 and an I-10 index of 17. She is currently funded by NHLBI with an active R01. Dr. Posniak is definitely one of the rising stars in her field, and it's my privilege and honor to welcome her to the show. Good morning, Nikki. Welcome to the Catalyst podcast. To begin with, for the benefit of our listeners, can you briefly walk us through your academic timeline from PhD to postdoc to assistant professor and how you successfully navigated those transitions?
Sure. My situation might be a little bit unique. I think everyone's situation is different. Um, as I was finishing my PhD, I had started a relatively new project that involved some collaboration between a lab at GW in cardiac electrophysiology and the Food and Drug Administration focused on materials that are used in medical devices. And so I had started that project probably about 6 months before I finished my PhD. And so as I was thinking about a postdoc position versus maybe going to the FDA for a job, I had approached my mentor at the time and asked about writing a postdoctoral application on this new project that I had started with the goal of picking up some new techniques and new skills from other collaborating labs in the Washington, D.C. area. And so I put together a postdoctoral application, which luckily was well received. And so then I went on to continue my F32 in a collaboration with some folks at GW as well as FDA.
Got it. Can you talk a little bit more about how your K99 project came to be?
Most of us probably have imposter syndrome. So I sat there and thought, how long can I continue to do this? But the postdoctoral work went really well. I was learning some new techniques, some genomics techniques. I started working with someone at GW in biomedical engineering that you now know, Dr. Matt Kay.
Yeah, Matt, he's a great guy.
Langendorf perfusion studies. So I had started some new techniques, some new work, and it was going quite well. And then I thought, well, I'll keep trying. So I decided to put together a K99 application that was kind of based off of that postdoctoral work because at that point, and I think different labs do this differently, where you might be kind of given a project from your mentor. At this point, I was sort of a free agent in that I had a project, and I had some really supportive sponsors and mentors who were always willing to help. But I kind of had to seek out what I needed to do and do the kind of lead the project on my own. I had a small budget, and I needed help with training. And so I just kind of reached out to folks who could help with that. And so I was able to develop that further for my K99 project without having to go through a difficult conversation about what I could take with me, which I think some postdocs may have to deal with.
That is interesting. And during the K99 phase, did you have to manage your award budget, or were you able to focus completely on your research project?
No, I mean, my mentors were fantastic in having me learn on my feet, I think. Um,
Okay.
and they had kind of encouraged me to take part in as many aspects of lab management as I could. So I did have a budget. I had the K99 budget, and I also had some departmental money, which was really helpful. Um, I had a student towards the end, I think, of my K99 that helped, um, someone that I could manage. I had, I think, an undergrad and maybe a medical school student at that time, just helping with a small component, but enabled me to have some mentorship training as well. And then both of my mentors always had me kind of review their grant proposals and help with some of the writing. And so I think there was some on the job training during that K99 phase. I think you'll learn it's never enough, and each institution is different.
Right.
Even what you do learn, it helps so that you can apply that at your new institution, but you still go through a big learning phase, I think, when you start your independent position.
Got it. And then can you briefly share your experience navigating the faculty job search process?
Sure. I think people approach this quite differently depending on what they're looking for. Um, I was a little bit flexible in that I was okay with taking a position that had some teaching responsibilities. So I looked at positions that were pretty much 100% research as well as mostly research with a low course load. I was really focused on the Washington D.C. Virginia area because I have a family, as you mentioned. You've started a family. I had started a family. My husband worked here, but I was open to other locations as well as long as it was a good fit. And so I tried to find groups that had some cardiac additional cardiovascular labs in the department. Um, that had all research or research with a small teaching load. That's mostly what I focused on. Um, and yeah, I mean, and then you're just kind of flying all over the place. So I think that second year, again, I kind of applied broadly in the United States. I think I had maybe 8 or 10 different interviews, um, which was actually helpful because I didn't know exactly where I wanted to be. It was hard for me to know exactly which department was going to be the right fit. And so I think that was really helpful to compare and contrast different groups.
Got it. And were you looking at academic rankings as possibly a measure of the quality of students you could attract to your lab?
Being I'll say I'm a new PI, but I don't know, I'm 4 or 5 years in now. I can understand now why that might be a concern. It can be difficult, I think, to get good students, to recruit good students or good postdocs. At the time, for me, based on the labs I had grown up in, where it was, we didn't really have a lot of students doing our work. Like we did everything start to finish. And so I felt like you could kind of train anyone to do anything as long as you have good mentorship, right? So for me, that wasn't as critical. But I think if you're going to be in a field that's like very computational heavy or something that you really need specific expertise,
Right.
you're want to be in a good environment where they have another department or program that is highly ranked for that. I think it's going to depend on your specific topic and the technical skills that you need.
Got it. And as a new PI back then, when you were starting your lab, did you have difficulties attracting postdocs to your lab? And if so, how did you navigate that?
I think as a new PI, I think everyone kind of goes through this where you're trying to make a name for yourself and people have to say whose lab is that and what do
Right.
they do, right? There's some level of that. I was really lucky when I started my group that I had a couple of individuals that came with me or that I knew that I recruited to get the lab started.
Oh, that's great.
I owe a lot of our success to date to them because they kind of hit the job hit the job running or whatever the term is. Um, and they were like more senior. I have one senior level staff scientist and I had someone who was starting their postdoc who was already pretty well trained from a PhD perspective. And they were phenomenal in helping get the lab started, and I took the route of not taking students initially. So this year was the first year actually that I took a graduate student. I feel like throwing a graduate student into a new lab where there's nothing on the shelves and trying to manage a student and their project, I felt like I would be failing them a little bit. I had to get my own self set up first before I felt like I could do that. But each person takes a different approach. So,
Got it. Now, I wanted to switch gears slightly and talk about the grant writing process. So, when you were about to apply for your R01 application, were you able to generate preliminary data through the experiments that you conducted in your new lab? Or were you able to use the data that you collected during the K99 phase of your award?
I think that's a good approach if you're able to do that. Um, Things never go as quickly, I think, as you they will go.
Right.
The first year is hard, and I had not newbies in the lab, but it was still difficult. I think I would recommend that your first hire should be a really good research tech because it's going to be someone who can set up the pH meter and get the scales ordered, and they can kind of take that burden off your shoulders so that you don't have to micromanage everything because you're trying to get your animal protocols approved and your IRBs and all this stuff. So I think hiring a really good research tech or someone who has some experience is really helpful versus a new, like just starting student. Um, I did use a lot of my K99 data for my R01. We also had some data the first year that went into the first R01 submission. So yeah, I kind of agree with that. Like if especially if you're in a soft money kind of position, you need to try to start applying as soon as you're able. I started in 2016 at Children's and we had our R01 in 2017. So
Wow, okay.
yeah,
That's
so we were very fortunate and very lucky. I did have ESI status. And again, once you get your first R01, then that doesn't count anymore.
got it. Now, given your successful track record of winning the awards, first the F32, followed by the K99, and then your first R01, in your opinion, does grant writing become easier or harder with each successful award? What's your take on it?
I think you can see it both ways. Having written grants, whether it's pre-doc, post-doc, K99, is going to be helpful because you know how to formulate your ideas and kind of stack up the support for what you need to do. Um, but the K99 is very different than an R01, right? Because the K99, you're focused on training and what you're going to learn. But I do think that reviewers, people understand what it's like, and I think applying early is good because no one's expecting you to have 6 senior author publications your first second year into starting a new lab. Like there's a grace period there where people understand this person just started, they're getting their lab set up, they're hiring new people. I think if you start waiting until your startup funding is ending and you're in like year 3, 4, and you still haven't been overly productive, then that's really gonna hammer you on your numbers, right?
That's a great point.
So I think if you're able and you feel like you're ready, I would apply earlier than later. And the worst that happens is it doesn't get discussed, right? But you learn from it, so you get some feedback and you.
Makes sense. Now, do you apply for funding sources outside of the NIH? And if so, which ones?
Yeah, so we've applied for a lot of internal awards. So we're lucky we have the CTSI at Children's. We also have a board of visitors. So that's helped with getting some pilot data. But for external funding, we target NIH and American Heart Association,
American Heart Association. Did you
similar
apply
to.
for early career at the AHA or
I did. At the time, I think they had a grant and aid, maybe. So
okay?
I think I actually took a component of my K-99 and applied for a grant and aid, and it was like either it wasn't scored or it was scored very badly. But the same little bit bulked up application that went to K-99 was funded. So some
Yeah,
of it is luck, right? Some of it
the job.
depends on the reviewers and what they like and what they think is important. So you have to keep applying.
Yep, and have build a thick skin because those rejections come.
Yep. I used to get worked up when I would check for the scores, and now I'm just like, oh, it's okay.
Got it.
Kind of get used to it a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I wanted to shift gears slightly and talk about building a research portfolio. Now, as you're managing your own lab and getting pulled in multiple directions from grant writing, managing students, mentoring postdocs, overseeing research projects, faculty responsibilities, and whatnot, are you able to make time to build new areas of research expertise in order to expand your research portfolio? Or do you typically rely on your collaborations as needed?
Well, it's a good question. I think you can handle it both ways, probably. So for me, my initial training was mostly cell biology, cell physiology, imaging, molecular biology. A lot of in vitro work was my PhD training. And so I kind of can always easily fall back to that. Those are the experiments that you're still doing at 9 o'clock at night because that's your work, right? So I think it's like riding a bike. You kind of, the techniques change a little bit, but you still understand the underlying physiology and you can kind of figure it out, right? So like I've never used this machine before, but I know what it's supposed to do, so you can figure it out. Um, but some of the kind of research techs that I've recruited, especially my more senior staff scientist, has a background in vivo physiology and some optical mapping. And so, although I also have some of those skills, we kind of like work together. Like he's really the animal person. Like he gets the whole in vivo system quite well. And so I think it depends on who you bring in. And your lab will pivot a little bit, right? So like you'll start down one path and it leads you a different way, and you just kind of have to pick things up, or you send a student to do some training in a different group. But I think the way that most people do handle that, as you mentioned, is collaboration. So your lab is going to become known for obesity and optical mapping of hearts, right?
Right.
And you want to be that guy. Like you want someone to know, oh, I need someone that does this. That's the person. And I think maybe to my own detriment, I maybe haven't done that as well, but you want to be known as that person. And then you reach out to the people who do the patch clamp electrophysiology, or you reach out to the people who do the high throughput proteomics work. And we've done that a little bit as well. We do have some collaborators that specialize in specific topics, because I'm not going to learn to patch cells at this point. Like I just, between budget meetings, and it's just not going to happen, right? Or you bring in someone who does the computational stuff or the coding for you. And I think you probably bring a little bit into your lab, and then the things that are too far off, then you just really need to get those collaborations.
Speaking of collaborations, one of my mentors described it as going into a relationship and sprinkling some magic pixie dust. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. So, what's your general approach on building new collaborations?
Oh, this is hard. I don't think I have a good formula for this. I think your pixie dust comment maybe makes some sense. I think, some people I've just met on just an off chance at a conference, and, walked by a poster and someone was like, they're doing this. And I'm like, that's amazing. We could do this together. And then it just works. Some collaborations are way more productive than others. Some take time for them to kind of start meshing well. And some you kind of put together and you get a paper or two, and then it kind of just falls to the wayside because people go in different directions. So I think it's a little bit of all of that. But if we ever get back to conferences, I think those in-person small conferences are just great for that, like the Gordon type conferences where you have time to, it's not just a 5-minute elevator pitch. It's like you actually have time to run into people a couple of times and you might learn about something else they're doing in their lab that's not published yet, or some pilot work that they're doing. And that's the part that really clicks with what you're doing. So yeah, some of it's just a little bit of randomness, I think. And then at children's, obviously it's easier because you have a seminar and someone comes up and talks to you, and you're like, yeah, we could do that, and we're just 2 floors away from each other, so that's a little easier.
To that end, do you actively conduct professional networking or let it happen organically?
I think some people do actively seek it out, and I think those are probably the folks who become more successful than I will be because I'm just not that great at this cold calling networking. I think in science, if you can network, it's good for you, hands down, right? Those are going to be the people who are reading your papers and reading your grants. So I don't think it's ever bad for you. For me, I just get exhausted. So like the flying to conferences and all that, and then kind of being on to talk to people all day is just, it's tiring for me. So I think the more you can do, I think the better. I don't think it's ever really a negative to network more.
Yeah, I mean,
Just don't want it to be random networking, right? Like you want to have some kind of relationship or commonality between the two of you.
got it. Now, I wanted to shift gears again and explore your area of research. Now, I understand that your research focuses on investigating the linkage between chemicals used in plastics and its impact on cardiovascular diseases. Can you briefly expound on that?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned in the beginning what our lab is fo- focused on as far as a research funding is concerned is plastics. And so everyone knows about environmental plastics. Plastics are everywhere. They're polluting everything. There's links to, chronic health conditions. But I became interested in this topic through, again, a collaboration with FDA because a lot of these plastics, same plastics, are used in medical procedures, right? So we're interested in chemicals that are used to make medical devices. If you think of like blood storage bags, tubing circuits for cardiopulmonary bypass circuits, things like that, where these chemicals can migrate out of the plastic material and expose the patient. And so we've found that these chemicals have direct effects on cardiac function. And so that's kind of what we've been focused on primarily, and trying to decipher whether replacement chemicals, new alternatives might be safer.
Got it. And I understand you also conduct research on pediatric hearts. Can you expound a little more on that?
Because we're in a children's hospital, like we're obviously focused on pediatrics. So you have a young baby who has a congenital heart defect, they have to get surgery, they're put on a bypass circuit, they get blood products. Those are really the populations that are going to have the highest exposure to these different chemicals. But since I've been at children's, there are so many clinical scientists or research inclined scientists at children's who are just phenomenal and just have really great ideas. And so some of the topics I didn't actually even know about or think about until I came to children's. So one is we've been working with someone in transfusion medicine, which is focused on how blood is stored and what happens to those to red blood cells after prolonged storage time or once blood's irradiated, because you can imagine blood is not the same when it's donated on day one as it is 42 days in a refrigerated.
The whole RBC lesion that you mentioned.
Right. So we've started we have some pilot funding to look at this RBC lesion and how high potassium load might be impacting obviously cardiac electrophysiology. Another project we're working on with two of the cardiac surgeons at Children's is looking at postnatal heart development. So trying to understand how the pediatric heart matures after birth, and how congenital heart defects might impact or influence that maturation process, with the goal of looking at, post-surgical recovery, how drugs interact with the heart, how they may be different between a cyanotic versus an acyanotic child. And so we've kind of started some of these pilot projects that still kind of center on cardiac electrophysiology, but have more clinical focus. And I think that being in a hospital is really unique because you feel like you're still doing basic research in a lab, but you feel like you really have a connection to the way the field is going, the medical field is going. Now, whether that will have a direct effect tomorrow, probably not. But I think you do feel like you're making a little bit more of an impact, and it's more translational in a clinical type environment, probably similar to you with the human donor hearts.
Right.
Having that perspective from a clinician kind of makes it feel more significant, I guess.
Got it. And it appears that your blood transfusion project evolved organically through a collaboration. Can you expound on that a little more?
With that project, I had read a paper and I forwarded it to one of my, she's actually a mentor, but also a colleague. I had forwarded to her and said, is this real? Like, is this relevant? Like, I don't know this field, but this seems like this would be really important. And she was like, we need to talk. Like, this is something that is really important to her. And so I think again, it comes back to mentors too, being able to bounce ideas off people and say, am I like off in left field here? Or is this something that's really important? And they can kind of guide you back to, yeah, that's something that, docs are really concerned about, or that's something that's not as much of a concern because XYZ. So
Got it. Looking back, are there things you would have done differently? Or alternately, looking forward, are there things you are planning on doing differently?
yeah, okay. So differently, I think there's so many things I could do differently. One that you mentioned is networking. I really was not involved in networking at all as a postdoc because I didn't feel like I belonged in that network group. Like I was still like a worker bee. But it starts early, and you should start early. So that's one thing that I definitely would have changed. And then I think going forward, uh, from being a student to a postdoc and now especially K99, especially in the like career level that you're at, I feel like you feel like you're on a treadmill like the entire time, right? Like it's I need to be writing papers, or I need to be writing grants, or I need to be doing experiments. And now, even as an assistant professor, I need to review these grants for study section. I have to review these award applications. I have to interview people. It never ends. And so going forward, and even with this COVID process, I've just told myself I can do what I can do, and that is it. you
You
know,
that's
you can hope to be the well-known cardiac optical mapping person that travels the world, or you can be happy with training students and making good scientists and just being happy with your own work.
yeah.
Yeah, you just have to figure out what fits your lifestyle, and what you're happy with as far as like your research career, and then realizing that it's okay to just say I can't do everything. So that's what I'm hoping to accomplish in the next year. I don't know. We'll see.
No,
I think
that's
I'll feel
great.
guilty, but
And frankly, it resonates with me because up until I had a baby last year, for me, my focus was working 20 hours a day. I have so much experiments to do, grants to write, papers to review. And since I enjoy doing research, I didn't feel this was work. I mean, I enjoyed the whole process of it. But as soon as our little one was born, the values changed. And then with the COVID, it's like a whole different dynamic. And now I don't have that much bandwidth to be able to do what I used to do. But it's okay because at the end of the day, you have to understand what's priority, and you have to be able to prioritize things and be okay to say no.
yeah.
And it's a learning process for me, but I'm beginning to realize that that's what everybody has to go through. And personally, I really see that women PIs they go through so much more than male PIs in terms of having to manage a family as well as a research lab. And just getting a taste of it has just make made me realize that I mean the women PIs should be much more valued for what they do than
I don't I don't know about that, but I do think it can be different. But it depends. It depends on what you choose to do when you're outside the lab, right?
right.
So we like research. I mean, I'm a puzzle solver, right? So like I like to read and understand the connections. And so my hobby is reading. I can be happy reading a research article at night because I like it, and that's okay. You just have to figure out what you're okay with and what you like to do and try to reduce the things you don't like to do, I think.
Got it. Well, Nikki, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great eye opener for me personally in terms of understanding what it takes to create your own lab and some of the rigors of establishing it and what the process is like. Uh, and thank you again for taking the time to sharing your experiences and insights. We really appreciate it.
Yeah,
And
well, thank you and congratulations again. I wish you all the best.
with that, we will wrap up this episode of the podcast. If you liked what you have heard, I encourage you to share this episode with a friend. I'd also love to hear from you and how you are striving to be a catalyst. So I invite you to leave a comment on my Twitter or website. This is your host, Kedar Aras, signing off. Thank you for listening, and until next time, connect, discover, transform.